Hello and welcome to our special event on an analysis of Sri Lanka's elections that happened a fortnight ago. Welcome to all our panelists. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar. I am the Deputy Director of the South Asia Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this special event this afternoon in the United Kingdom and this evening in Sri Lanka. Before I introduce our panelists, may I also welcome our audiences who are watching this live on Facebook, and from where you can also send your questions, which we will ask to our panelists at the end of the discussion. If you'd like to ask a question to a particular panelist, then please do mention that. Otherwise, if it can be addressed to the complete panel as well. We have a Twitter handle, the LSE South Asia Center Twitter account. If you are going to tweet, please do tag us at @SAsiaLSE, and the hashtag is LSE Sri Lanka 2020. I now have the pleasure to first introduce my colleague and moderator, Dr. Rajesh Venugopal. Dr. Venugopal is assistant professor here at the London School of Economics in the Department of International Development. Professor Jayadeva Uyangoda doesn't really need any introduction for any audiences of Sri Lanka, but he's Emeritus Professor in Political Science at the University of Colombo. Swasthika Arulingam is a lawyer and a member of the Liberation Movement, a left feminist political movement of women in Colombo. Javid Yusuf is a columnist at the Sunday Times, and Gehan Gunatilleke is a researcher at the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford, but is currently based in Colombo. I mentioned that last point because, for the benefit of our audience who would not know, that one of our considerations in inviting this panel, with the exception of Rajesh, of course, was that we wanted to invite panelists who were actually present in Sri Lanka at the time of the election a fortnight ago on the 5th of August. Before I hand over to Rajesh, just one more minor thing, which is that there are several very, very interesting things about the current government in Sri Lanka that has come to power. And one incidental thing throws up a very important ethical and technical question about the ways in which democracy functions in the modern world. And that is captured in the title of the event, which is that you have a government in the modern world now, only the second time in recent modern memory, where two brothers have the two most important political positions in the governance of the country. The first time it happened was in 2006-2007 in Poland, where Lech Kaczynski, who was then president, nominated his brother Jarosław Kaczynski as the prime minister, and they held those two posts together for about 16 months till the Law and Justice Party of Poland was voted out in November 2007. In the case of Sri Lanka, you have the president, Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was elected last year. You have the prime minister, Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was formerly the president of the country as well, and is a brother of the current president, who is now the prime minister. You have one of the brothers, Mr. Chamal Rajapaksa, who is in the cabinet. You also have one of the sons of the current prime minister, Mr. Namal Rajapaksa, as a cabinet minister. Now, what is interesting in this scenario is that this is technically and legally absolutely possible in a democracy. You know, they have won tickets, they have won their seats through, by belonging to their party, and it is democratically elected. But it does raise interesting questions about the nature of governance. With that, I will hand over to Dr. Rajesh Venugopal, my colleague, and I will come back during the discussion, and we'll take it from there. Rajesh.
Thank you very much, Nilanjan. Welcome to all of you to the London School of Economics, to this event on the elections in Sri Lanka. A warm welcome to all of you from all parts of the world who are watching this, from the UK, from Sri Lanka, from everywhere else. The parliamentary election in Sri Lanka earlier this month, following on from the presidential election last November, has given rise to a very significant political shift. Many very extraordinary things have happened in the past 6 months. And in these results in particular, we have noted the fact that the two largest parties that had hitherto dominated the political system, the political stage in Sri Lanka for many decades, for the first time, have no representation in parliament. They have all but disappeared from the mainstream parliamentary system. What do these results mean? What has happened to the political system? What is a legacy? And what can we say looking back at the previous government in retrospect? What, if any, changes can we expect to see with the new government with such a large and powerful majority in power over the next 5 years? And finally, where is the change, if any, going to come from? What are the new voices, the new trends that we should be looking to? What are the dynamics that are going on right now that may still be in nascent form, but that may well become very important over the next few years? With us here to discuss all of these very important questions are a very distinguished panel of experts. We are going to organize this so that I will call on each of the panelists to share with us some of their initial thoughts. And we'll be following that up with a round of questions that I will pose to them, after which we will have the floor open to questions and answers from you, and I'll hand it over to Nilanjan Sarkar, my colleague, at that point. So let us start. Professor Uyangoda, would you like to start and please share with us your reflections on the elections?
Professor Uyangoda, you need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now? To respond to Dr. Venugopal's invitation just to make some preliminary comments about Sri Lankan elections and possible political consequences as well as significance of that election, let me begin by saying a few things about what kind of change that has happened. See, elections usually have a tendency to redefine the politics of a country. And this election has significantly, it is likely to change Sri Lankan politics quite significantly due to a variety of reasons. One is that the election has brought into power a new coalition, and that coalition is
I think we might have lost Professor Uyangoda's connection. Rajesh, I'm going to try and contact him on the phone, but shall we invite Swasthika to speak?
That is, in a way, the political part of there seems to be some disturbance.
Yes, Professor Uyangoda, we lost you, lost your connectivity to audio. Could you start again from where you said that it is likely to change the nature of politics and the new coalition? Could you start speaking from there again, please?
Right. Then the elections has brought to power a new coalition, which is led by Sri Lanka Potujana Peramuna, which is the political property of the ruling family. And SLPP is quite interesting, a new party. And it doesn't have the name party to its name. That is very significant. It's called Sri Lanka Potujana Peramuna Front. And it has brought together a range of ethnic, social, and ideological constituencies under the joint leadership of the president and the prime minister. And the coalition has a number of co-partners. It's also very important for us to understand its political significance as also possible political consequences in future. The core constituency of the coalition is, as I said, Sri Lanka Potujana Peramuna, and it has some remnants of the old left. And of course, in terms of its social foundations, it has brought into its wings the new, business elites, new business class.
Professor
Uyangoda, beneficiaries.
Professor Uyangoda, I'm going to stop you because when you move your face away from the screen, we can't hear you clearly. So if you have any notes near you, why don't you bring it to your front so your face is towards the microphone so we can hear you, if that is fine with you? I think we might have lost him again because of the connectivity. My apologies for this. But yes, Professor Uyangoda, we can't hear you when you move your face away from the screen. So yeah, if you have some notes you're looking at, why don't you bring it in front of you so you can look down and
yes,
speak.
Yes, I have them in front of me now.
Yeah. Sure.
So,
go ahead.
So I was saying that this new coalition has also brought, together a new business elites who are beneficiaries of both economic liberalization and globalization. And also there's a new, professional elite, an urban-based professional elite. That's also a very strong component, a strong constituency of the new coalition. And there's a newly emerged urban professional class that has also been playing a very significant role in the ideology and political directions of this coalition. And still,
I think we're going to have him back in a moment if we give him a bit of time. Or
could you possibly suggest to him also that he could switch off the camera to save bandwidth and just?
I was just going to message him about that.
Of the defense and security establishment.
Yeah. Professor Uyangoda, we are losing your voice in between. Why don't you switch off the camera so that the connectivity will become better, so we can at least hear your voice? If you just switch off the camera and speak from where you were saying that because of a new professional elite and an urban elite, they are, there's going to be a change in the nature of politics. Why don't you switch off your camera? Your camera is still on.
Yeah, I have switched it off.
No, your camera is still on. Yeah, that's fine now. Yeah, that's fine. Now you speak,
now
we can hear.
There's another very important, there's also another very important constituency in the coalition. That's the retired senior officers of the defense and security establishment. And finally, the Buddhist and Catholic clerical elites. So quite interestingly, there's a, very wide, configuration of new social, political, and ideological forces that have been brought together to form this coalition which has come into power in Sri Lanka. So we can expect what
Oh dear, I think we've lost the connection again. I'm going to, when Professor Uyangoda comes back, I'm going to ask him to stop because we're not really getting it, and let's hope that his connection will get better. Rajesh, should we ask Swastika to start? And Swastika, in case your connectivity is weak, feel free to switch off the camera because it's more important that we hear what you're saying. Is that fine? Yeah? Okay, great. Why don't you go ahead, Swastika?
I'm going to just start off with what Professor Uyangoda said about the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna being the political property of a family. I think that kind of summarizes it in one phrase, the nature of Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna. So when I am from a minority community, I'm from the Tamil minority community, and many people from minority communities, when we were watching the elections, one of the things we had particularly about the last presidential election as well as this parliament election, we were watching it with a lot of anxiety and fear. Not because soon after the presidential election anything particular happened, or not that we knew what was going to happen in the future, but in terms of our experience of living under the Rajapaksa regime in the past. As many of you know, there was killings and disappearances, and it was a very, very authoritarian state. Centralized, family-oriented authoritarian state. So we have this experience. So you're watching, particularly from the minority communities, you were watching with a lot of, I would say, anxiety. And as expected, the Gotabaya Rajapaksa came in November 2019. He won the election very decisively. And then once he won the elections, it was very clear that the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna was also going to win the parliament election. And the COVID-19 crisis and what I would call the illegal state of emergency which existed, or the illegal state of lockdown which existed in this country, that also helped them to win the parliament election. So they won again with a 2/3 majority decisively. And then you find the president being from the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, the prime minister being from the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna. So as a person from a minority community and someone who has been engaged in political activism and so on, my primary, people like me, a primary concern is how do you engage with a state which revolves around a single family? Because under the previous government, as you mentioned, the 2015 good governance government, we were living under, it was not, the democracy was not very different in the sense that that government was still rolling in economic reforms, which was essentially anti-people, anti-poor. They were rolling in security agendas, which was anti-people again. But at least we had the freedom to say what we want without being in fear of arrest. We had the freedom to protest on the streets without being arrested by the police. So we were living in a sense of pseudo freedom where we could say whatever we want, we could criticize the government, but nothing what we were saying would actually reach the ears of the government, or they would substantially change the policies. But we were still able to say it. Under this government, we know for a fact that this government will not tolerate dissent. Even an inch, they would not tolerate dissent. We know for a fact that working with this government would mean working very closely with the family, and there's no other way to work with the government. We also know that any kind of plans and policies is going to be top down, and we also know it's going to be very authoritarian. So how do you work with a state, the executive, and now the parliament also? How do you work with these bodies of the state when you know that it is going to revolve around the brotherhood, the male members of one family? So that is one of the main concerns we have as of now, of people who have been engaging with the state on various policies, laws, and so on. The other thing is, of course, the nature of the campaign, which was carried forward by the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna during the election campaign. So there was two recurring themes, and a person from the minority community, it would strike us very significantly, these two recurring themes. The first theme was they would continuously say that the reason why the good governance government failed and the security of the state. And when they mean the security of the state, what they really mean is the security of the executive was compromised, is because the president was from one party, the prime minister was from another party, and they could not work together. They could not resolve the differences. And in the end, the Easter Sunday attack happened and so many people died. So don't repeat that mistake again. You have the president from the same party. Now you vote the prime minister also from the same party. You also give us a good mandate in the parliament so we can build a strong government. We can build a secure state. We can push forward development which is beneficial to the people. So give us a strong mandate. And I think the resentment people had towards the last government, this kind of propaganda worked with people, particularly in the South. The other recurring theme in the election campaign was this building of, reclaiming of the Sinhala Buddhist identity. And one of the things you would hear is that the previous government, the coalition government, sold this identity, broke down this identity, working with the international community, listening to Western interests. They broke down this identity. They made the Sinhala Buddhist identity weak. So give us the mandate to rebuild this identity again, to make Sri Lanka a strong Sinhala Buddhist state again. And again, I think this kind of resonated with the people in the South. So the person in the minority community watching this kind of electoral campaign rolling, it was interesting to see the vibrations or the reflections or the consequences of this election campaign in the North and East, where the Tamil minority is predominantly live, the North and East part of Sri Lanka. So when the main party in the South is building this narrative of a Sinhala Buddhist ideology or a Sinhala Buddhist state, the reflection of that was seen in the North as well, where a large amount of election campaign rhetoric was fought on this Tamil identity, on the nationhood of the Tamil people, and about how do we protect ourselves from the advancing Sinhala state. And it did not just come out of mere rhetoric also. The moment the Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into power, one of the things he did, he started taking steps to establishing the Sinhala Buddhist identity in the East as well. For instance, he established a task force, an archaeological task force, whereby to protect the archaeological heritage of the Eastern Province. But what it really meant is to revive the Sinhala Buddhist archaeological heritage in the Eastern Province. So things like this kind of created a nervousness within the Tamil-speaking people in the North and East. And when the electoral campaign was also rolling on this whole, let's build this Sinhala Buddhist state again, that also had direct consequences and direct reflections in the way electoral campaigns played out in the North and East of the country. Those are like my initial thoughts in terms of the initial thoughts.
Thank you very much. Could I please ask now Mr. Javid Yusuf to share his opening thoughts with us?
Javid, you need to unmute.
Yeah, I'm doing that. Am I okay now? Am I okay now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity. To add to what some of the comments made by Professor Uyangoda and Swasthika, as mentioned, within the government itself, there are several constituencies who will inevitably be jostling to push their agenda as the time goes on. And also, interestingly, this government, which the results of the election springs from the weakening of the two major political parties that have been part of the political landscape, the UMP and the SLFP. The Podujana Peramuna is, of course, a creation or draws from the SLFP, and the Sri Lanka, the Samagijana Balavegya draws from the UMP. But of course, while the Samagijana Balavegya and the UMP remain ideologically very similar, and their division is only based on issues of leadership and so on. The Podujana Peramuna, though it originated from the SLFP, has now taken a characteristic which is which is also seen to be, and they don't hide it, because I think that's been a very effective tool for their political success. Their Sinhala Buddhist identity. Now, I don't see a Sinhala Buddhist identity by itself or per se bad, but the point is it is done with so much of insensitivity, and also there is questions as to whether the Sinhala Buddhist image that one tries to portray is genuine. Now, the initial symbols after taking oaths, where the cabinet was shown in and so on. If you recall, in 2015, when President Maithripala Sirisena took his oaths, he took his oaths at Independence Square at a very simple ceremony, which was, to use a bit of a hackneyed term, a secular event.
Oh, okay, sir. Start video.
Have you lost me?
No, we can hear you. Yeah,
Okay.
continue. Sorry.
Yeah. So, but when the present government, all their events, the taking of the oaths by the president, the taking of oaths by the ministers, and so on, were done in very Buddhist environments. For instance, the members of parliament, I think, took their oaths at the Dalada Maligawa, the sacred temple in Kandy. So this is an image that they have been portraying. And the unfortunate thing about the election result, in my mind, is the the extreme racial forces, or those who represent those forces, have come out strongly in parliament, and there is a very strong lobby now in parliament. For instance, the candidates who came in the first three in the Colombo district. One is a Rear Admiral from the Navy, who has very strong extremist views, as well as two politicians who also have those views. But it does not mean, in my view, my reading, that the ordinary Sinhala voter falls prey to these people very easily. But what has happened is, over the years, from the time of the 2015 government, they have been propagating and creating fears among the ordinary people, and playing on the insecurity of the Sinhala masses. And when I say the Sinhala masses, I mean the ordinary masses, because this is also driven by professional and business interests who use these extremist groups or extremist line also for the advancement of their professional and business successes. So this is a extremely situation which causes extreme concern, and the fact that there is a 2/3 majority in parliament adds to that concern. So one hopes that in the days to come, that many of our fears or concerns may be proved wrong, but that we'll have to wait and see. I think Professor Venugopal also raised this question about the legacy of the 2015-2019 government. Actually speaking, if you go before 2015, we all know that the country was heading for an authoritarian state. There was hardly any room for expression of democratic dissent, for freedom of expression. There were a whole host of journalists who were targeted and so on. And then 2015 came. And with that, in fact, I think the most vital legacy of that government was that democratic space was opened up, where people were not afraid or were not hesitant to criticize the high-ups in government in the most strident terms without fear of reprisal. But while doing that, the chauvinistic or extremist forces made use of that democratic space that had now been created to also spread their, gospel, if you like to call it. But the failure of the government of the day, the 2015 to 2019, as in other areas, was their very ineffective government. And they allow events to take their course. They did not they did not prove themselves effective either in the economy or in the political scenario and so on. So it sort of created a kind of a sense, or at least a message was totally given to the public and believed that there was some degree of chaos within the government sector, within the governance sector. So in that situation, I think the legacy of that government is the democratic space, and I think it still prevails. Because if you see, we had the unprecedented situation of a big strike in the Colombo port while the election was on, just days before the election, without any reprisal or anything like that, which was unthinkable prior to 2015. But whether that situation will remain after these elections, one has to wait and see. And also, as I think Professor Uyangoda mentioned, the increasing involvement of ex-military personnel in government also suggests that there is the manifestation sort of a military style strategy to achieve whatever goals that are sought to be achieved. So it is going to be a bit of a complex situation, and one of the first point or first act that the government is giving its attention to is to abolish the 19th Amendment. And in fact, it was the 19th Amendment that helped to create the democratic space, because the Right to Information Act was passed. It was then also the independent commissions were strengthened considerably. The process of judicial appointments was also sort of strengthened, so that the independence will not be curtailed. So all these, the public servants, the police, all of them began to enjoy that that freedom, and in fact, good officers made use of it. But of course, in my view, that process is not complete, because merely because the structures have been set up, only those who are committed to functioning independently will make use of it. Others can fall back into sort of politicized actions depending on the situation. So even police officers, as we all know that during the 30-year-old war, there were policemen recruited who have known nothing except emergency rule. So the normal laws they are not familiar with, or they are used to functioning without the normal laws, but under emergency rule. So all these people have to be retrained for democratic values and so on.
Yusuf, could I ask
yeah.
We will come back to you during the question time.
Yes. I'm just about to stop. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to say that we have Professor Uyangoda back. He has been extremely enterprising. He went out for a walk on the road to ensure that the connection is back. But Professor Uyangoda is now back. Chris, if you can unmute Professor Uyangoda. And Professor Uyangoda, you can hear me, can't you? So
I can, yes.
if you would please, I think we lost you when you were talking about the coalition and the support of the professional elite and the urban group. If you could continue from there and speak. I'm really sorry about the fact that we lost you, but everyone's very keen to hear you. And please speak for about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Well, what I was going to say was that, are different from what we have seen in the regimes in the past. Then we have a possible political scenario of reforms. And in the past, for example, from 2015 to 2019, there was an agenda of democratic reforms. What we have now under the new government is an agenda of what one may call post-democratic reforms. Sri Lanka, seems to have entered a new phase of post-democratic political and constitutional transformation. So I can identify 4 major aspects of the political change in the coming months, perhaps. One is that Sri Lanka will very fast emerge a new form of national security state, because the national security has been one of the crucial, political issues that the Sri Lanka Padujana Peramuna highlighted in its presidential and parliamentary election campaigns. Secondly, there is a strong possibility of reconfiguring power relations between the executive and the legislature of Sri Lanka state in favor of the executive and headed by the president. The envisaged constitutional amendment that's to abolish the 19th Amendment and introduce a 20th Amendment would seek to create a system of government in which the president would be the center of political power and state power. That will result in a way, making the legislature, the parliament, an insignificant component of the state structure. Thirdly, there can be reforms through the constitutional reforms as well as legal reforms, a lot of de-emphasis on civil and political rights, rule of law, checks and balances, and limits on political power. In other words, the kind of parliamentary democracy that Sri Lanka has known for several decades, although with certain setbacks, would no longer be an important aspect of defining Sri Lanka's politics in the years to come. So we might have a kind of a post-liberal democratic, political order. So those are the kind of, main contours of the kind of political transition that is possible given the mandate that the new government has sought from the people and obtained. Actually, it has obtained a mandate for reforms that are not democratic reforms, but post-democratic reforms. And there seems to be overwhelming popular support, at least in the Sinhalese society, for that kind of, a post-democratic reform agenda. And the government can always claim that, they are responding to a political or rather popular demand for that kind of shift towards a post-democratic political order.
Thank you very much, Professor Uyangoda. So we turn now to Gehan Gunatilleke for your opening remarks, please.
Thank you very much. You can hear me clearly? All right. So let's speak a little bit about the future of Sri Lanka's parliamentary democracy, I just want to build on what Professor Uyangoda just spoke about. So Article 4 of the Sri Lankan Constitution vests the legislative power of the people in parliament. And parliament consists of elected representatives of the people. So the institution that we call parliament is the most fundamental means through which the people's power is exercised. So Sri Lanka is first and foremost a parliamentary democracy. And that, as Professor Yang has quite rightly pointed out, is what is at stake with the reform agenda that now is before us after the election. But I want to just quickly take stock of the last 5 months. The previous parliament's ordinary term was to end in September 2020, but it was prematurely dissolved on the 2nd of March. Now, that may have been the politically sensible thing for the president to opt for, given the fact that his party had a minority in parliament at the time. But this early dissolution came with certain constitutional conditions. And one of the conditions was to restore parliament or have a new parliament sitting within 3 months of that early dissolution. And that became impossible due to the COVID-19 crisis. So we really had something that was totally unprecedented in our constitutional history. That is a period of over 150 days where we had neither a parliament nor real prospect of an election. So what were the consequences of that? Now, we can be practical and say that the containment of COVID-19 was done rather well by the government. But the question to ask really is whether a functioning parliament would have been an impediment to proper containment. And I don't think so, because party leaders at a very early stage pledged support to the government, had an emergency session of parliament been convened according to Article 70 of the Constitution. Now, having a functioning parliament that pledged support to the government during a national emergency, mind you, would have been quite critical for initiatives that go beyond just containment of the virus. A good example is the right to franchise, and the right to franchise would have been better safeguarded. After all, we were going in for an election because that was considered to be the democratic thing to do. Now, I wonder whether people followed the fact that over 2,000 people, and I know this is a fairly insignificant number in the greater scheme of things, but it's still an important number. Over 2,000 people stuck in mandatory quarantine centers did not get a chance to vote at the election that was held on the 5th of August because the legal framework did not provide for special facilities to be offered to them. Now, if a functioning legislature had been in place at the time, there could have been at least an attempt to revise the election law to enable broader participation, because after all, we were wanting to further the ideal of democracy at the time. Now, apart from that, the economic consequences of the lockdown are still being felt by people. And the country needs a comprehensive legislative response to the problems faced by numerous industries, many people who've lost their jobs and affected by the emergency. But given that context, we now come to the post-election priorities. And the immediate reform agenda appears to be to dismantle the reforms introduced by the 19th Amendment, reforms that were meant to strengthen checks on the executive president, strengthen the hand of the prime minister and parliament. Now recall the 19th Amendment was not just a Yahapalaniya initiative or good governance initiative, which was associated with the previous government. It was actually a compromise position between the initiative to totally abolish the executive presidency and the agenda to retain the presidency as a check on parliamentary power. Now, if you read Jayadava's analysis on the politics around the 19th Amendment, I think he does a good job of actually revealing the compromise that was in fact the 19th Amendment. Now, the 19th Amendment actually received the support of all but one MP sitting in parliament at the time, including many of those who are actually calling for its repeal today. And what is the reason for its repeal? The stated reason is the instability of the previous government, where the president comes from one party and the prime minister from another, and they were forced to cooperate, and it impeded efficiency and decisiveness. And we saw evidence of that taking place. But given the current situation, it remains a rather peculiar reason, because the current government has a supermajority, and the president and the prime minister are not only from the same party, they're from the same family. Surely if anyone can make the 19th Amendment work, it would be the two of them. So here's what we are left with, and here's how to connect the dots. It seems that the reform agenda of this current government is much more structural in nature. It's not really about coordination and efficiency. It's actually an agenda that seems to intend to dismantle the representative democracy we currently have and revert to hyper-presidentialism that was introduced by Jayadeva. Although there seems to be tacit public consent for this reform, there are two factors that I want to point to. Now, the first factor is that reverting to hyper-presidentialism runs contrary to repeated public calls for reducing powers of the executive president, and these are calls that have existed since 1994. So the current appeal for abolishing the 19th Amendment, this is the second point, comes actually in a moment of crisis, in a moment of fear, and in the aftermath of unique inefficiency and chaos of a previous government. And I just want to make the point that times of fear and crisis are never appropriate times to change the basic law of the country. I think it's reactive and hasty, and the consequences will be difficult to reverse. So the current government is actually capitalizing on a unique moment of crisis to manufacture consent for a radical restructuring of Sri Lanka's democracy. And I wonder whether this consent would have been available to the government had we not been in a crisis that is an overlap between a public health, global public health emergency, and of course, the Easter Sunday attacks that took place last year. I think it would be much more sensible for this government to show restraint and focus instead on delivering on developmental goals, improving efficiency, because these are, after all, its stated unique selling points. And I think it is important that we preserve our parliamentary democracy in the aftermath of this election, because we really should not be deviating from a trajectory of reform that existed for more than 2 decades in a moment of crisis, because in a moment of crisis, our judgment could be quite clouded. I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Gehan Gunatilleke. Thank you to all of the panelists for those very, very important and insightful comments that you're sharing with us. I'm going to start by asking our panelists a series of questions to probe them a little bit further on some of the things that they have said and some things that they have not said.
Rajesh, just to interrupt you to say that Swasthika has lost her electricity connection, so she's going to come in through the phone, but we can continue our discussion.
Yes, okay. I had my first question to her instead, but let me move on and ask Mr. Javid Yusuf actually to share with us some of his reflections on what this election result means for Sri Lanka's Muslims. What does it mean both in terms of what the prospects are going forward, and this is of course in the history of a growth of anti-Muslim sentiment that we have witnessed in Sri Lanka since at least 2013, 2014, and which has become heightened since last Easter Sunday's attacks. The second part of that question is, who did Muslims vote for in this election and why?
You need to... Yes, that's... No, you need to unmute yourself. You're still muted. Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah. I think this current phase of anti-Muslim sentiment really emerged from around 2012 with the emergence of the organization called the Bodhumala Sena. And since that time, the message of hate or Islamophobia, or whatever you call it, was spread among people precisely to create that insecurity among the Sinhalese masses. Very various stories of trying to create infertility among Sinhala women by Muslim businesses, the halal issue and methods of dress and so on were used to create that fear and insecurity among the Sinhalese, who at the grassroots level have lived well with the Muslims without with minor skirmishes, probably like in any society, but by and large without a problem. Then what happened was those took adequate steps to control those organizations like the Bodhimala Sena, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Then actually the Easter Sunday attacks, in a sense, one could say that the seeds of hate that were sown from 2012 onwards bore fruit with the Easter Sunday attacks, because it was such a shocking event which shook everybody, including the Muslim community, and created a further sense of insecurity, which was capitalized by extremist forces to continue the anti-Muslim agenda. Now, with regard to what the future portends for the Muslims under this government, time will tell. But knowing those who are in positions in government and the different groups which are in government, some of whom have openly been portraying that these religious schools called madrasa should be closed. There should be one country, one law. That is, we have, as you know, a number of personal laws, which in a sense is a manifestation of the diversity that we all enjoy in Sri Lanka and have enjoyed without a problem for so many years. So it is these same forces who are positioned in various sections of the government as well as outside supporters. So that pressure is definitely going to come. And the government will have to take strong action on that. But ideologically, the government's thinking also is on that plane. So therefore, I can't say that I'm very optimistic. I hope I'm wrong. But the future is not that great, because now, as you probably know, I'll just mention this and stop this point. During the COVID-19 crisis, the right of burial of COVID-19 deceased was denied in Sri Lanka, despite WHO having sanctioned burial or cremation and 182 countries opting for allowing those families to opt for either of those. But when Muslims made representations that they be allowed to bury their dead who succumbed to COVID-19, they were not only not allowed, they were sort of totally disregarded, and no explanation whatsoever was offered as to why the right to bury, which was available in 182 countries during the COVID, was denied to them. And that, I think, is symbolic of almost a contempt with which the Muslim community may be treated. The other question, Professor, was, you asked me two questions, I think.
My question was, who did the Muslims vote for this time and why?
Yeah, at the presidential election, the Muslims voted almost en bloc against the current president. In these parliamentary elections, there are reports that in some areas, there has been somewhat of a turnaround of Muslim votes. How much, I'm unable to say, because we are still trying to find out details, where they have supported candidates locally on the basis, because this was a line pushed by government supporters. If you don't join us, you will not be able to survive. And I don't mean survive physically, but you know that the Muslim community is by and large business oriented. So there are now increasing number of professionals. Business is something very much a part of the Muslim ethos. And these businessmen have been sort of coerced or have been persuaded into believing that unless they sort of join hands or support or becomes part of the government district, that they will not be able to pursue their businesses. So that seems to be, from some reports, an increased amount of Muslim votes this time at the parliamentary election. I don't think that is a large number, but I think it's basically driven by business people for their own ends. So I think that is, in a sense, a position, and I will conclude with a remark being made by one of Sri Lanka's most experienced politicians, Mr. Gunatilleke, a very senior Communist Party politician, a very good analysis of political events. He once said that the trouble with Muslim civil society is they are very greatly influenced by the business community within the Muslim society. So I think that sort of fits into what I have been saying. Thank you.
Rajesh, we have Swastika back, but she doesn't have electricity. She's joined in through her phone, so she can hear you, but I've asked her to keep her camera off, but please pose the question to her.
Thank you very much. Swastika, can you help us to unravel the electoral verdict in the North and the East? What happened there? Why was it so surprising? We have the rise of the EPDP, the TNA not getting as much of a share of the vote as they would have, and even the SLPP looking like they have made important gains. What was happening there, and how do you read it?
Can you hear what I'm saying?
Yes.
Since post-war, since 2009, that is, the Tamil National Alliance, which is like a coalition of Tamil political parties, they have been elected particularly by the Tamils in the North and the East, as almost as their sole representative to represent their interest. So this has gone on for almost 2-3 election cycles, and the TNA was the sole representative, or by and large the largest electoral representatives of the Tamil people. This time's election was quite interesting because the TNA, as you mentioned, lost a substantial number of seats to 2 different kind of clusters of parties. On the one end, you found splinter groups from the TNA, members of the TNA forming different parties, breaking out of the TNA, forming different parties. And the reason for breaking out of TNA was that the TNA was betraying the nationalistic interest or betraying the nationhood interest of the Tamil people. So these are what I would term as the extreme Tamil nationalist parties with extreme Tamil nationalist kind of agenda. And so they ran the electoral campaigns with a very rhetorical election campaign without, in my opinion, without much substance in terms of how they are planning to achieve what they claim to achieve. So that is one cluster of Tamil political or Tamil parties, which won, these kind of political parties won around 3 seats in parliament this time. On the other side, you found political parties who stood for elections in the North and the East, which were forming coalition with the government. So their entire political campaign was about, we are going to form a coalition with the SLPP government. So we are asking for your vote because for the next 10 to 20 years, this government is going to be there. So do you want to be with the strong ones, or do you want to be with the TNA, which just promises many things but does not actually achieve anything because they don't have any actual power in the state? So these parties who were promising a coalition parliamentary position with the SLPP government were buying votes from the people, or were asking votes from the people on the basis, We will bring you development in your regions. We will give you jobs. So therefore, vote for us. And interestingly, this kind of political parties, including the EPDP also, were given substantial amount of votes in the north and the east. Now, it's a bit hard to analyze as to why voters went in this direction after a substantial period of 10 years of giving the TNA the massive mandate. But one of the things which I could think of is there is a rise in economic issues in the north and the east. People are in massive debt. There are villages in the north which I have visited. They don't even have proper food to eat. It is that bad. So there is a belief amongst majority of the people of this country that if you want some kind of development to come to your region, you have to vote for the winning party. And when the SLPP has got the presidential power, there is also a kind of a belief that the SLPP is going to win the parliamentary election. So therefore, the only way to bring development, the only way to bring jobs, the only way to live a basic decent life is to align with the strong party. And I think that is why the SLPP also got several seats in the Vani districts as well as some districts in the east, as well as Tamil parties or Tamil political candidates who promised a coalition a parliamentary position with the SLPP. That is my take on what happened in the north and east.
Thank you very much, Swastika. Professor Uyangoda, I want to turn to you. You described that Sri Lanka is now in a period of a post-democratic, authoritarian and majoritarian era. How do you situate this in the regional context, in a region and a situation where you have Modi in India, you have Xi Jinping in China, and you have potentially many other similar post-democratic majoritarian leaders? Is the situation going to be favorable regionally for President Gotabaya Rajapaksa?
Well, to respond to the first part of your comment, Rajesh, about 10 years ago in South Asia, India and Sri Lanka, we had a joke to say that Mr. Modi was following Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa. Now we can say that Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa is following Mr. Modi, because actually the political transformation in Sri Lanka, all the three concepts you use, ethnic majoritarian, post-democratic, authoritarian, and can also even say autocratic, it's exactly the model that you find in India. And Sri Lanka and India, in terms of their political transformation of the state, transformation of the relations between the state and ethnic minorities, and the rise of not only the majoritarian nationalism, but also the total capture of the state by the hardline ideologues of the majoritarian nationalism. It's there are a lot of very close parallels. For example, when you see the religious symbolism displayed at the India's Republican Day, and also Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa's this inaugural meeting at the Colombo temple, there are a lot of similarities, appropriation and public display of all the majoritarian ethno-religious identities. So actually in Sri Lanka and India, you can see that the state and society have entered what one may call post-secular stage. The post-secularity and post-democratic nature go hand in hand in both India and Sri Lanka. That's the first point. The second point is about the kind of political transformation that we can see in Sri Lanka. The kind of Indian, the role of India in Sri Lankan politics. And there was also a joke in Sri Lanka, and some of my Indian friends also shared this. India could make or unmake a government in Colombo. You see, that's a old joke in the 1980s, 90s, at that time. Now, the present government wants to abolish, at least some section of the present government wants to abolish the 13th Amendment, or else at least to weaken the 13th Amendment. So I'm not very sure whether that is all that easy for the Rajapaksa government either to weaken or even abolish the 13th Amendment, because 13th Amendment is the only symbolic gain that India has through its extremely costly involvement in Sri Lanka's ethnic conflict. Actually, 13th Amendment, that was the most significant actually constitutional change in Sri Lanka since independence in 1948. It sought to restructure the Sri Lankan state in order to provide a political solution to the ethnic conflict. Actually, President Javid and the UNP at that time initially were not willing to, experiment and try out a political settlement of the ethnic conflict. Actually, the UNP was deeply divided on that issue. And Mr. Jayadeva, the president, used coercion, a lot of coercion to force his ruling party, even his cabinet, to accept the J.R. Rajiv agreement, and then, of course, the 13th Amendment and the Provincial Council system. Nevertheless, ultimately, the UNP, agreed on that and actually embraced revolution. And the SLFP initially opposed it. SLFP also embraced devolution. The JVP initially, led the second insurrection on that very issue. But later the JVP also embraced devolution and the Provincial Council and 13th Amendment. So there's a, very, very significant political consensus across all political parties in Sri Lanka that 13th Amendment was important. So now what the new government is going to do is to unravel and dismantle that, all party political consensus on the 13th Amendment and also the importance of the provincial council system and devolution. Of course, it has a lot of negative dimensions. For example, some people say it is not political power that has been devolved, but corruption. Some people say provincial council system a white elephant. These are the, important criticism. Nevertheless, from India's point of view, dismantling the provincial council system, or even to bring in a constitutional amendment that would give what is called in Sri Lanka 13 minus, not 13 plus, would be very, very tricky. So I'm not sure whether it is as easy as it is being said to either weaken or to do away with the provincial council system and to abolish the 13th Amendment. So India's role in Sri Lankan politics, as well as the emergence of the China as a major player in domestic politics, not only in Sri Lanka, but also in the other South Asian countries, in Nepal, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in the Maldives, in Sri Lanka. You see, what happens in Sri Lanka and politics, partly at elections, voters go and, vote and elect their own representatives. But at the same time, domestic politics, in the final analysis, is, implicated in and also, played out. So at the part of the, regional, the competition between two major regional powers in the Asian continent, India and Sri Lanka. Sorry, India and China.
Thank you very much, Professor Young.
Is that an adequate response to your question? But can I make a comment about this ethnic and rather the Muslim and Tamil politics? You earlier posed these questions to Mr. Yusuf and Swasthika. Can I make a brief comment on that?
Yes, please.
Now or later?
Running out of time for this segment of this. Can we come back afterwards and we'll ask you to share your thoughts on that at that time?
Sure.
Gehan, can I just ask you to expand on some of the points that Professor Uyangoda talked about? This morning, the president made a speech in which he talked about a new constitution coming into being. He also talked about repealing the 19th Amendment. Is it possible that instead of actually repealing the 13th Amendment or repealing the 19th Amendment individually, that the president could just simply wholesale go for a new constitution in which those become irrelevant and you will start from scratch again? And what, in your view, are the implications of the new constitution that he has been describing today?
That's an interesting question. I actually don't know what the new government has in store in terms of a new constitution. Some of the reports, you're quite right, report that there is a committee that's going to be convened to look into a new constitution, to draft a new constitution. There are other reports that talk about a cabinet decision to abolish the 19th Amendment. Now, I think there's always some confusion when it's reported in that way, because the 19th Amendment is not a separate section in the Constitution. It's a package of reforms, and it introduced and integrated many different new sections, into new articles into the Constitution. It repealed some old. So it's an entire package of reforms. So it's not as simple as repealing a particular law or particular section in the Constitution. So I think amongst these reports, we also hear some reports that the government will retain certain features of that reform package. For example, the 5-year term limit of the president, and also the 2-term limit of the president. There's also some chatter about retaining the right to information that's granted under Article 14A of the Constitution. So I think there will be some decisions that need to be taken, because the election rhetoric was all about repealing this amendment that had caused so much disruption and inefficiency in the previous government. But when it comes down to the actual details, it's sort of simple as repealing a section. They're going to have to go into it much more carefully and maybe repeal the parts that are impeding their reform agenda or their agenda, and parts that perhaps the public show some support for, like right to information. There's no evidence that there was an election mandate to repeal the right to information. I think that needs to be retained. Whereas I think at least there's tacit consent for the strengthening of the executive presidency. So the ability to hold ministerial portfolios, which is now not allowed under the current constitutional framework, may be restored, where the president could actually exercise power over ministerial portfolios and preside over cabinet as an actual cabinet member of the cabinet. So we might see those reforms. And of course, I think we're also hearing about reforms to the 13th Amendment, particularly the powers granted in terms of land and police. So I think one thing to understand about the way in which the government generates consent for these types of reforms is quite interesting. There are first extra legal measures that are taken to either ignore a provision in the Constitution or simply sort of violate it. And then the reform brings it back into line where it becomes subsequently, retrospectively legal. So right now, the president will exercise powers over a portfolio, assign a portfolio to himself, which is very clearly not permitted under the Constitution. But I think eventually we'll have constitutional reform that allows that more explicitly, where they don't have to rely on sort of constitutional gymnastics to come to the conclusion that that is possible. So I think we will see those piecemeal short-term reforms to begin with, but there could very well be a much longer-term agenda to replace this constitution with a new one. They will need to, of course, go to the people with a referendum to actually get the consent of the people, and that will be a huge task. So I don't know whether we're just hearing these reports right now and there's a little bit of confusion, or whether there's a very serious attempt to replace this constitution.
Thank you very much, Gehan. Can I just go back to Professor Uyangoda, and you were about to share some reflections on the points on Tamil and Muslim politics, I think.
Sorry, you need to unmute yourself, Professor Uyangoda.
Right, sure. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, the point I wanted to make is a very brief point. That is that there seems to be a shift, some shift in the politics in Muslim society as well as Tamil society in the north, as reflected the last election campaign. That is that there is an argument in both Muslim and Tamil society that old style politics, minority politics, are no longer relevant to Sri Lanka after 2020, or even 2019, I would say, after the presidential election last year. The argument is that Muslims and Tamils should ignore the political rights and work towards economic and developmental rights, right? And therefore they should collaborate and cooperate with and participate in the central government in Colombo in order to achieve their economic rights. So Mr. Javid Yusuf made the argument that in the Muslim society, that is business community probably has been coerced to accept that position. But in Tamil society, also there is a very interesting shift. You know, there are the last parliamentary elections, at least there are 3 or 4 streams and strands of Tamil politics that have found representation in parliament. One is that the TNA or ITAK, that's the, you know, traditional form of, you know, parliamentary Tamil nationalism led by Mr. Sambandhan, that ITAK. And of course, then Mr. Douglas Devananda's, you know, the former militant organization that has become parliamentary politics, which has always been in alliance with the Sri Lanka Freedom Party since the 1940s, or rather 1990s. And then 2 other entities emerged at the last parliamentary election. One is that, you know, 2 MPs from 2 new parties, Mr. Gajan Ponnambalam's party and Mr. Vigneshwaram's party, who advocate a kind of, you know, new version of, you know, old militant Tamil nationalism. Mr. Vigneshwaram seemed to represent a new form of Tamil nationalism with Hindu religious bent. It's almost like a Hinduized Tamil nationalism. And Mr. Gajan Ponnambalam represents a kind of a, you know, more militant Tamil nationalism. So then there's Mr. Angajan Ramanathan and some sections of Tamil society who make the point, very interesting point, although I don't agree with it, politically significant, politically important. They say that what takes precedence in terms of interests of the northern Tamils are not political rights, but economic rights. So the devolution is not important in terms of political terms. So they de-emphasize their political rights of equality and overemphasize what they call economic rights. So this is a very interesting new development in Tamil society in terms of politics. So what is also fascinating is this, all the 4 strands of Tamil politics find representation in new parliament. So DNA's, you know, near monopoly of representing, you know, Tamil society has been actually questioned, and in a way, you know, the DNA doesn't have that near monopoly of representing Tamil political interests. But in the Muslim society, at least in Colombo and Eastern Province, you know, among, you know, new business elites as well as professional elites, very similar to in Sinhalese society. There are new business and professional elites in Sinhalese society, Tamil society, and Muslim society who look at politics very differently. And this parliamentary election, in a way, gave expression to those new arguments. So, you know, my feeling is that, you know, ethnic relations, or rather politics of ethnic relations, has significantly changed, and this, you know, composition of new parliament reflect the changing dynamics of ethnic politics in Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much, Professor Uyangoda. Mr. Javid Yusuf, do you have a response to that? And also, if I can also ask you to just share with us what you think the future of Muslim politics in Sri Lanka is. How do you see the situation evolving in the next 5 years? And what are your own views about that?
Well, I think that will all depend on what the government really does. Now, if you see, as I mentioned in passing, there has been a demonizing of the Muslim community since around 2012, and that unfortunately has seeped into different layers of a single society. Uh, but the if the government reaches out to the Muslims and reassures them, and if it shows that Muslims as much as Tamils, the minorities form an integral part of the country's uh, demography, then certainly there is hope that these things can build us into a stronger nation. But the dynamics and the ideology within the government suggests that we will be pushed further into this anti-democratic this thing, because I think most of us know that in any part of the world, the Muslims count the practice of religion as very much close to the heart, even more than the business, political rights, and so on. So when matters of religion are being tampered with and are likely to be tampered, then there's going to be some kind of unease and insecurity among the Muslims. So that will condition the response that Muslims have in the days to come. I mean, if you look at the identity-based Muslim political parties, which have grown over the last maybe 20, 25 years, and who have held sway among the Muslims, one thing is, while they use the Muslim identity to garner political support for themselves, they never really did it to encroach on the rights of the Buddhists or the Sinhalese. Of course, within the north and east, there was some misunderstanding between the Muslims and the Tamils, that the Muslims were, particularly during the conflict, the years of the conflict, that Muslims were more aligned with the state, while the Tamil community and the LTT in particular was attempting to challenge the state. But actually what happened was the Muslims, they charted a different political course, which was not intended to, or was not meant to undermine the Tamil political cause. But the Muslim political leaders failed to explain that.
We are running out of time. Could I ask you to just conclude your thoughts, please?
Yeah, the Muslim political leaders failed to explain that to the Tamils, and as a result, there was some minor friction, some suspicions, and so on. So, to answer your main question, what form Muslim politics will take will depend entirely on what course of action the government takes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Swastika, could I invite you to give some concluding comments and also to give us your view as to who the forces for change are? The government is very powerful now after this election result. Where, if anything, is change going to come from, and what, if anything, are the positives that we should look to from this election?
The force of change, or the only force which can hold the government accountable to whatever it is doing, is the people of this country who actually voted the government. But who is going to drive the people, who is going to direct the people, that is a question to be asked. And based on the type of election campaign which happened, very ultra-nationalist Sinhala Buddhists in the south as well as in the north, various kind of politics in the east and east as well. When you look at that, I think there has to be a different kind of political force which has to come into being. And we saw the remnants of that political force, even though it was very weak, even during this election campaign, and which was not much spoken about during this discussion. The left of Sri Lanka. Traditionally, the left has been represented in parliament. I mean, I'm simplifying this, but by the Janata Vimukti Peramuna. And in this time's election, they have formed a coalition called the National People's Party. They have gotten 3 seats in parliament. And then you also find other left parties like the Frontline Socialist Party in the south, and also there are New Democratic Marxist-Leninist Party in the north. There are other left parties in different parts of the country. So even though they only got a very little percentage of the votes, their intervention in the election campaign was a diversion from the otherwise nationalistic identity charged election campaign of the main parties of Sri Lanka. So I think the hope actually is coming from the left of Sri Lanka, even though right now I feel it's fragmented, it's very weak. But we see a bit of hope in terms of what happened when we were observing the election campaign process and how the left parties campaigned on very, very vital issues such as debt, free education, free health, even on things like racism, which parties in the South were not talking about. So I think in terms of directing the people, in terms of creating a change, I think the left of Sri Lanka, which is kind of a bit, I won't say dead, but kind of a bit weak, needs to revive itself. And that is where I think the change is going to come in terms of a different political direction.
Thank you very much, Swastika. And lastly, can I just ask Gehan also to give us your concluding thought on this point? The government has a supermajority. They can have a constitution of whatever type they want. How are they going to be held to account? Are there any mechanisms and are there any forces out there that one should be looking towards?
So I think this government has come on a particular message of being best at managing crises. Right, Sri Lanka actually is in the midst of multiple crises. It is in the midst of a global crisis that everyone is in, the COVID-19 crisis, but also it emerged from the Easter Sunday attacks. And the unique selling point of this government is crisis management. And we have to admit, compared to the previous government, this government is actually a lot better than the previous government at crisis management. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And I think one would have to be extremely politically partisan to not acknowledge that. But the problem and the paradox with a government that projects itself as crisis managers or solvers of crises is that eventually when you solve crisis, your unique selling point starts to wane. You have to either keep generating crises in order to be relevant, or you solve the crisis and then people move on to the human developmental goals that are in the background that don't go away. Education spending, spending on healthcare and housing, unemployment, cost of living, these things are not going to go away. These things are going to be recurring themes that the voters are going to be thinking about. And I think there will be a time when crises are in the back burner and these issues come into the forefront. And remember, in 2010, we never expected a government that had defeated the LTTE, ended a war that was 30 years long, ended an armed conflict that no one thought could be ended, and got such a fabulous majority in parliament, eventually a 2/3 majority when some crossovers took place, could be defeated in 2015. The electorate seemed so ungrateful to that particular regime in 2015 when it betrayed that regime and voted for someone who crossed over from the cabinet of that very regime. So I think there is always an incumbency fatigue that sets in. Crisis management cannot be perpetual. And I think this government has to graduate from crisis managers to actual deliverers of human development goals in order to sustain power. If not, the average voter will punish the government in elections to come.
Well, thank you very much to all our panelists. This was absolutely fantastic. We've, I'm afraid, come to the end of our discussion, but if I could just say a couple of things before I thank all the panelists and thank a very, very loyal audience on Facebook who have been with us all through, is that I think there are some very important bigger questions to be debated that are probably important for global politics at the moment, but are especially important for South Asia. I pick on a particular phrase that Professor Uyangoda used, which was post-liberal political democratic order. That what does post-liberal actually entail? Are we, in the English language, which allows for so many euphemisms, essentially referring to governments that are banking and governments that are actually riding on populist support, which for some reason a lot of liberals do not see as being entirely democratic? Or are we having a discussion about, does liberalism need to reinvent itself? And this is not particular to Sri Lanka. This is not specific to Sri Lanka. It is applicable to a lot of current political parties. The other is a point that Javid made, which was very, very interesting, and again has been made in other countries in South Asia. And I have been thinking about having a panel discussion, a longer panel discussion on this matter, and that is that what happens when we believe as citizens of the extremely complex civilizational societies of South Asia that through history, for long periods of time, communities have lived happily, have lived with, as Javid said, with minor skirmishes between them for the longest period of time. And at the same time, Professor Uyangoda also used the phrase post-secular. It's an argument that has been used in other polities in South Asia as well. Bear in mind that India, with its longest constitution, did not have the word secular in its preamble till later. It was inserted later, but also that latterly there have been arguments that the majority community in India has in fact always been secular because it has always welcomed people and lived with people, presumably with minor skirmishes, etc., etc. So we actually don't need to call ourselves formally secular. This then raises the whole question of what is secularism as a constitutional ethic? And it therefore gives it a legal status. What is it that needs to be practiced as part of it? Or can we assume a certain secularism and do away with the constitutional legal concept? In other words, I do think we should have a very serious debate, yes, for ourselves, for the sake of, focused on South Asia because of the nature of our center, but even outside, that is secularism as a constitutional and legal concept culturally intelligible to citizens of the countries from the lowest levels upwards? Or is inter-community living that has happened through centuries in several of these civilizational instances something that can continue but requires the legal protection that comes with the term? These are important, these are big questions. This is tough talk, these are controversial, but I do think that in global politics, we have come to a point where these are also now questions that we should debate rather than have assume these to be tendencies that are either universally acceptable or universally understood both within nations and amongst nations. On that note, thank you very much to each of our panelists. We have had some technological challenges. Thank you to our audience for having stayed with us. Thank you to Professor Uyangoda and Swasthika for your enterprise in switching from your laptops to your phones to be part of the discussion. Thank you, Javid. Thank you, Gehan, for making the time. Thank you very much, Rajesh, my colleague. And I have no doubt that we will continue with these discussions again. Thank you and goodbye from London.